Welcome everyone to another episode of Reimagining Cyber. Rob Aragao here, and today's guest is Demetrius Comes, who formerly served as CTO and CISO at companies like GoDaddy, Warner Brothers Games, and Sovereign, and is currently a CISO executive advisor at EVOTEK. He also leads the chapter's working group for Professional Association of CISOs, otherwise known as PAC, which is we're going to focus our conversation on today. Demetrius, really happy to have you here with us today. Anything else you'd like to share on your background?
Yeah, I mean, I spent 15 years in the video game industry building software for the masses. The interesting part about being in video games and what sparked a deep interest in security was early in my game development career. We found out that basically 1 out of every 4 games was being purchased and the other 3 were being compromised in some fashion, either through the black market or that sort of thing, which sparked the interest in, I mean, if you work with game teams and see how hard they work and how much they strive to get products out that will, ignite the imagination of their audiences, and then, 3/4 of them not being paid for, that was definitely a focus. And I think it's a big reason why you see so many games have moved online with online protections now, is to try to prevent that from happening. So that was where my, spark for security came in since then, and, grew into a role all the way up to the CISO.
That's extremely interesting, kind of how that led you to the cybersecurity and the aspects of it. And it brings up actually a thought back, I don't know, might have been a year or so ago. We had one of our guests that was really talking about kind of the digital aspect now of video games, and really because of the security mechanisms that are behind it. But there's still opportunity, right, for fraud, of course, as always with anything. But yeah, that's great to hear that that's kind of how you got your start and drove you down this path. And I wanted to talk about, Demetrius, that I kind of mentioned in the intro, the great work that's been done to kind of launch the Professional Association of CISOs, PAC. And would like for you to just one kind of give a basis of, what is PAC all about? And more importantly, also kind of in that regard, what sparked your interest to get involved?
Cool. So I actually got involved because of some friends in the industry that then reached out to me once they formed, because this actually started well before me. There's people that deserve a lot more credit about getting this whole thing started than I do. However, the passion around this group, and where I think all CISOs need to know about it is literally going to become a location for CISOs to be able to go and communicate with each other, share experience with each other, understand and promote what the roles and responsibilities are of anybody in security, and make sure that those folks are well armed when they go and take those big seats as a CISO, and understand what liability they're taking on for themselves. How do they go about addressing that liability? Who should they be reporting to? That's a great debate to have, because many, many times you're seeing CISOs report into the CTO or the CIOs, yet not directly to the CEO. And therefore, they're not in as many meetings as potentially they need to be, because security is not just about the technology end of it. In fact, most of the time, as we know from report after report after report, the weak link is the humans, not the engineering, right? So, this group is meant to promote those type of things. I would liken it. I wouldn't hold this, exactly to my specific words, but you can think of the PAC as something like what the ABA is for lawyers, right? You can imagine a time in the future where the PAC has put out certifications. If you don't pass that certification, maybe that becomes a requirement to become a CISO at a publicly held company, that sort of thing. None of that is true yet, and this group is very new. But these are the types of ideas that are being bounced around. That way, we can hold ourselves accountable. We can communicate and handle the details. And if the government does want to, put restrictions and that sort of thing, we can be that enforcement arm.
And that's a great parallel to draw. I like that approach. Knowing about what you're doing with PAC, that does make a lot of sense tied to the ABA. One of the things you called out that I think is critically important, I'm glad you called it up right up front, is CISOs today, or someone who's looking to become a CISO, needs to truly understand not just the reporting structure, which is critically important, I get that for sure, but the liability, the personal liability aspect that's now taking back, right? Over the past year, we've seen that accelerated with so many different examples out there. So I think it's critically important. I'm glad to hear that that's part of the kind of theme or topics that are definitely covered there. So another thing I wanted to get into is, from PAC's perspective, you talked about some of the things from an educational kind of perspective and everyone getting together, which is great. I mentioned if you want to become a CISO. So what guidance would you start kind of offering people there as they're looking to elevate into that role specifically?
Well, first, I think you need, somewhere between 7 and 15 years in doing it to step into that role, at least at the executive level, so you can see, because security in many organizations becomes this cross-cutting organization. It is unlike, a CTO where you're focused on just the technology, right? It's more akin to what COOs and CEOs do, which is, across the whole company, keeping things in balance, being able to train your customer service representatives to know when they're being vished or phished, or they're trying to be scammed while they're working with a customer. And is that even our customer? To also being able to do networking scans to make sure that the technology is securing us as well. That broad base and understanding all the things you need to consider, and then how to work with all your counterparts across the organization. Because you as the CISO or the VP of security or whatever the highest level of security is in your company cannot do it themselves. It has to be everybody's job. And having them understand that and giving anybody or sharing the experiences with some of the newer security folks coming up the chain will be the next generation CISOs. So they understand that vast majority of your job is going to be partnering with other portions of the organization, explaining to them why what they're doing is not secure and how they need to go about changing it, and working with them to get it done is the only way we're going to move security across and level up security at all the companies in the country so that we can take advantage of that.
I agree with you there. I think that it's critically important to have the experience, as you said.
Yes.
Right. Understand, kind of the foundational elements of cybersecurity for sure, but more importantly, it's understanding how they do interconnect to deliver what's appropriate for the business. So yes, we have to obviously drive at how we protect the organization. We have to understand what that given organization's risk appetite is as well. And it doesn't matter what vertical they're in, because even they're in, financial service, it does not matter. It's the individual organization has a specific risk appetite, and you better understand what that is pretty quickly, which also plays into, the stakeholders that you were talking about that they have to engage with. They have to understand to build a rapport, have the right communication, speak the right language as part of that, So I think those are really good elements that it sounds like PAC is helping support as people are looking to evolve and up-level to become more of a business with technology still tied in kind of CISO, of the future, if you will.
The other thing the PAC is focused on is ensuring that twofold, making sure that the folks that are going to be taking on these big seats for CISOs at companies understand the liability they're getting themselves into. But also, on the other hand, the PAC is working hard to make sure that the government and the companies understand the level of risk that those people are taking on. Because if there ever becomes too big of an imbalance, and because we're going to show all the potential security professionals out there what the risk is. And if we don't start mitigating that risk, you're going to find yourself a lot less people having a much larger hesitation and putting their hand up for that role.
Yeah.
I mean, let's face it, 8 CISOs have gone to jail in the last few years. We're not Section 16 employees. We don't have that level of protection. Most of the time, companies don't even give us D&O insurance, right? And that's one thing the PAC has already provided. Once you join, you can sign up to get liability insurance. So these are powerful things that the group is doing so that we can protect ourselves, but also educate and make sure that the businesses understand the level of risk these individuals are taking on. Because we have chosen, as a company, as a country, however you want to word it, is if there's a security problem, it has to be the CISO's fault, even though they don't control all the pieces and aren't even at that top tier of executives yet.
Yeah, we have had many examples. You're absolutely right. One of the things I know that's important as part of PAC is the code of conduct. So I wanted you to kind of just share a little bit about, the relevance of it and why it is really, truly a very important aspect of people becoming part of PAC and the way they should be, in essence, conducting themselves.
So the team that put this together within the PAC was truly, lawyers and really some of our best CISOs across the planet. What I liked about it was it again mirrored much of what the ABA did, right? Like, here's your code of conduct. If you join the group, you're going to do this. And if you don't, there will be a mechanic to expel you from the group if you don't follow the code of conduct. Mm-hmm. I don't see how we can be a respected organization if we don't have that. We have to hold ourselves to the highest possible standards so that we can act as the beacon for those standards to everybody else, pulling the rest of the other organizations up. We have to have that. Otherwise, we lose our moral high ground in the conversations.
It sounds like, as you're talking about what the way the ABA kind of operates, is almost kind of a blueprint that you've looked at, and obviously making the proper adjustment for the CISO role and what we need to take into account as well, which is back to the point of liability being a critical aspect of it as well.
I don't know if we used it as a blueprint, but it is when you started, I think it was more of like, we started down a path and I went, is anybody else doing the same thing like we're doing? And then we looked over, oh, it's kind of like that. And then that we started drawing similarities out of the two of them. And it's helped communicate what our goals are because there's already one established that we can look at and go kind of like that.
Yeah, makes sense, right? You got to make the adjustments for sure. So that makes sense. So I want to transition, talk a little bit about the role of kind of what I would refer to as the modern CISO. We've already got into it a little bit. You were talking about, understanding your key constituents, the stakeholders within the business, understanding, what the appetite for risk is, and that could be even in different parts of the business, but understanding again how technology fits and cuts across, as you mentioned, Demetrius, different elements, that deliver different services, capabilities, routes to market, all of the different, opportunities that drive the organization to also bring forward revenue, not just the protection side of it, not just the protection of the brand and everything else that comes along with trust and so on. There's a lot more going on in the new modern CISO role. So one of those, in line with everything we've just been discussing, is, how would you guide them to properly engage with the board?
So a couple of things. One, any new CISO that's coming in, it's going to work with a board the first time. You need to be able to state where you're at, where security currently is at. And there's some really good frameworks out there. There's CIS, there's NIST CSF that you can pull from, have an assessment done, and it gives you a baseline, right? It doesn't, there's still frameworks. They don't cover perfectly everything for every industry, although NIST CSF does a pretty good job of that. Understanding the company and saying, here's where we're at. Here's where I think we should be. And then negotiating with the board and senior leadership to know where we're going. And then how fast do you want to get from point A to point B? I think if you get that in place, you're setting yourself up for success. If you don't, then what ends up happening is you're pushing for, a CMMI score of 4, and the rest of the business is like, we got an appetite for 2. What are you talking about? Another way to look at it is Synopsys put out a report 10 or 15 years ago that I reference a lot called CISO Tribes. The idea behind this is there's basically 4 traits that an organization exhibits around security. And there's 4 traits that a CISO exhibits around security. If you and the company you're working for are exhibiting the same traits, you'll be successful. If you're exhibiting 2 different traits, that's a problem. And real quickly, the overview is there's a cost center mindset. There's a compliance mindset, meaning security only gets better when compliance gets better. There's a tech enabler mindset where it's hey, I'm bringing all this cool technology. Look at all the safety things we can do. This is usually in software development. You get the engineers excited about some of the security stuff you can do. They start reacting to it. And then lastly, there's the business enabler, where you're saying our security is so good that customers are choosing us, that we're getting a surplus of customers because they trust us to do the business effectively, right? Even if you just use those 4 boxes, laid them out with your board and said, currently we're a compliance-driven organization, but I believe we should be a business enabler. And they go, we agree. And you've laid out what the traits are and what's going to have to change. Even that will give you enough. Just make sure you have where are we starting and where are we going and what's the speed in which we want to get there. If you can get those things aligned, the path becomes a lot easier.
It's funny you bring that up because I haven't used that in a while. I actually use that.
CISO Tribe, really good.
Yeah, because I think it's so relative, right? And even like we're talking about, to me, a lot of what in conversations I'm having and educating people to get to this point of really being the business enabler, like you just described, right? Because why? Having the conversation at that point in time with the board, there's more relevance. You understand the right vernacular, communication, right? And we talk about this many times in this podcast because we kind of launched at this point in time back several years ago where we were driving the aspects of cyber resiliency. And resiliency and cyber resiliency or digital resiliency, whichever you prefer to call it, resiliency in and of itself at the executive level, at the board level, is very well understood because they understand operational resiliency. They have to. It's part of the way they normally operate. So that kind of connection point as a business enabler conversation became very, very valuable at that time. The other thing that you just discussed, which I'm a huge fan of, is you can use whatever you want for your maturity model, right? If you want to use a traditional kind of CMMI approach and take it there. And if you can get to a 4, my friend, good for you.
I don't think any company should be able to couldn't say that. Just 4 gets pretty complicated to get to. 3.5? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a nice aspiration, but Keep that inside your head, right?
Yep.
But I think the aspect that's important as you're getting that, you're building that trust, right? You're proving yourself out, and your program and your people and processes all part of that, is what I refer to as you set kind of that path forward. You present what that is to the board. You get the buy-in, and you know that basically what you're doing is you're saying, hey, I'm going to get to 100% of this thing over here. And in your mind, it's like, it's only going to take me 50%, maybe 75%, because I need a quick visible win to get them to continue to fund and invest more into my program that I laid out for them, the path. In my timeline, I can start accelerating after the fact. But if I failed out of the gates, I may no longer be here myself, right? So I think that's, again, something you called out. I just wanted to kind of amplify a little bit because I think it's critically important for sure.
And I think there's opportunity for the new CISO coming in, because many organizations, quite frankly, are so behind on where they need to be for security that you don't even have to really set up the roadmap to be like, I'm going to get this fast early win. It's usually just lying there. Like, at least from my experience so far, like, you come into a place and you're like, you're missing a CMDB. If we don't know all our assets, I don't know how we can think we're protecting all our assets.
I love how you asked the question. Oh, so do you have a CMDB? Do you know where all your assets are? Yeah, I do. Really? Let's take a look at it. Oh, well, yeah, there's all these gaps. So yeah, exactly. Because no one knows exactly where everything is, but let's do better. Let's do better. Hey, so I got to ask this question. Wouldn't be, in the theme of what's happening in the world if I didn't ask this question. AI. So from your perspective, right, there's its shared challenges, on us as cyber professionals, but there's also benefits. So I'd love to get your perspective as a whole, kind of the pros and cons, if you will.
So first of all, I had the benefit of the practice that I worked in at EVOTEK, actually put together, some internal white papers on the subject, and I got to be the one to write it. So this is a particular subject that's near and dear to my heart. My view of all the AI stuff out there right now is there are a few new attack surfaces, right? There are, you can reverse engineer some of the prompt responses and try to get it to dump any memorized data out and that sort of thing. But the vast majority of the tooling that's coming along, like you look at Microsoft's Copilot or, anything that's going to help your workforce do more and more quickly, means they have to consume the data within your company. And if they're going to do that, then it really goes back to security hygiene and security basics at that point. Do you know who's accessing this data? Do you know that they're only accessing the data they should be being accessed to? Is there all their IAM roles, the IAM roles that they should have? Or because they've worked at the company for a decade and they've moved around between 3 different groups and you haven't removed their permissions and re-added their permissions when they move the group, they now have permissions to everything at the company. And that means that person gets phished. And now the threat actor doesn't have to go through God knows how many documents trying to find the piece of, financial data they're looking to leak to the press. Instead, they're just asking Copilot, where's this data? Mm-hmm. And then it says, show me the sources, and it spits it right out.
Yeah.
Right. So when I see AI from a defensive posture of AI, I'll talk about offensive in a second, but from a defensive posture of AI, there are a few new attack surfaces that we have to address. The prompts and how we go about what gets asked in those prompts, that sort of thing. And there are some pretty good tools out that are starting to act like a proxy where they, vet the question before it actually goes through. I think DLP, it becomes incredibly important, because if you don't tag your data or what's allowed to be searched and what isn't allowed to be searched, then you're just turning it over to the AI, and the AI is just a mathematical construct. It's not a thinking machine. You ask it questions and it solves a mathematical question's problem and spits back at the answer. So it's the security hygiene piece that I think that through my time at EVOTEK, I spent a lot of time communicating. That's where you need to focus. Make sure that your basics are in place. Do you have all the, are your IAM policies where they need to be? Are your policies about what tools are allowed to be used and what tools aren't allowed to be used? Do you have the ability to stop people from using tools that you said they shouldn't be using? Make sure you have those controls in place, and then lock them down to only the tools that the company has agreed upon using. Because most of that legal construct, not necessarily a security construct.
Yeah.
But we need to be there to help those things move forward. As for offensive security, I think it's going to accelerate the types of attacks that you see across the spectrum. Reason why is, when you did reconnaissance, I've been a pen tester before. You do reconnaissance, and you're sitting there like you're relying on your mental agility and your mental ability to memorize a whole bunch of data that you had come back in, and then say, okay, where's the weak spot? How do I develop the attack plan? That sort of thing. Imagine being able to recon, a company with a couple of million nodes, throw it in an AI and go, tell me where's the weakest link. I mean, now all of a sudden the attack patterns speed up, right? And if the defensive guys aren't doing the exact same thing and running the exact same scenario and then asking it, where can I be attacked? So it understands like, this is where I see the arms race. It'll still be the same arms race, defenders versus attackers. The rate at which it will escalate will get much faster because we can ask these much more massive questions and we don't have to rely on the limited ability of us to be able to memorize it or write code around it or that sort of thing, because AIs are great at picking out patterns.
Yeah.
And that's what we're looking for.
And that's a good example, right? Because it does take me into, thinking about red teaming, blue teaming aspects of how AI can help both sides of it. Purple teaming is part of that equation as well. But that's a good way to kind of look at it. And it's one of the things we've talked about as well in previous episodes is that we understand that the bad guys in essence have this head start, and they kind of always will, because there's no borders of what they have to deal with and constraints per se. They can kind of go let loose, right?
Quite honestly, they don't like any professional white hat has things that they will not do.
That's right.
Right. We are bound by laws. It's the same thing that the criminals have over the justice system, right?
That's exactly right.
The criminals don't obey the laws. They can break the rules. So they will always have the advantage, right? The idea is to make it high enough, painful enough, and when they get caught, make the penalty high enough so that we discourage the behavior.
Yeah, or go back to your point about just having that good cyber hygiene put in place, right? The more difficult you make it on them in the first place, your target, not as soft as I hoped it was, I'm moving on to the next guy. Good, go take it somewhere else for sure. Demetrius, one thing to kind of close things out on PAC, just talk about what's coming up, right? Where the chapters, just how can people get involved? So if you can share some information, it would be helpful.
The best way to get involved is the website is theciso.org. You can go there. There's a membership link that you can fill out. Once you're signed up, you can then look over the liability insurances that we're putting out. If you're concerned about that, myself and a few others run what will launch as chapters. So there'll be local cities chapters, probably towards the middle, late second quarter of this year. It'll be some of the first meetings there. We're trying to get together like a packet that when somebody steps up and says, hey, I want to run a chapter, we can give them enough information. Like, here's what the structure looks like. Here's the roles you should be able to fill. You should have at least, 3 or 4 people, and they should have, somebody's got to be the president, vice president, and probably a secretary, and, maybe a treasurer. Like, these are the roles you at least have. Like, if you don't have at least that, you probably shouldn't even start a chapter because you don't have enough interest yet, that sort of thing. And getting them like, here's a framework for running a meeting. Here's the framework for running an event, that sort of thing, just so people have something to start from. That's look for that on the website probably in the next, 2 to 3 months. There's an incredible amount of work going on. We'll be doing some, videos released on just what it's like to be a CISO and things like that. Like, all this is coming in the near future. There's so much work going on in the background. It's almost staggering. Every time I go to another meeting, I'm like, really, all this is going on? It's all volunteers. Like, that's how passionate people are around the subject. And that's what I love about it, is like, this is a group of professionals that have literally just said, we're in a dangerous situation as a profession and as businesses. And if we don't address this, because if we put the risk too high, people will stop stepping up. And if we don't train people and make sure they understand what they're getting themselves into, people won't step up. And we have to have these people step up. Otherwise, we'll just continue with some of the same security issues we've had over and over and over again. And, with the geopolitical world the way it is, I'm not sure that's where anybody wants us to be.
Yeah, it's a fair point. Fair point. Well, we're going to include obviously the link in the show notes so people can take a look at that. And again, as you shared, right, you're really at the still early stages of building up, but a great opportunity for them to get involved. And I think that's great. I may raise my hand to participate for sure, because I think it's a great cause as you went through it. So Demetrius, thank you so much for coming on and sharing exactly the different work that you guys are doing. Great, I think, for what is a gap currently in the marketplace for us in the cybersecurity realm. Just thinking about if you're a CISO today, considerations you better be aware of. Partner with one another, collaborate, and by the way, help kind of the next evolution of new CISOs to come to the marketplace as well and help us all. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate it. Thanks, Rob.
Hello, producer Ben here, and before I ask you to follow or subscribe to the show and leave us a glowing 5-star review, I just wanted to pick up on something that Rob said near the beginning of the conversation. He mentioned a Reimagining Cyber episode that looked at the cybersecurity mechanisms behind gaming. The edition in question is number 87, called Digital Marketplace Security and G2A's Strategy. G2A is, of course, the world's largest digital marketplace for digital products such as video games and software, and their Chief R&D Officer, Dorota Robel, was the guest.
We treat AI as the first line of defense in our security infrastructure to help us detect vulnerabilities before they lead to harm. However, I am a big fan of hybrid model. So from one point, we are relying on AI technology and solutions, but I also believe that human touch is really important.
That was from episode 87, called Digital Marketplace Security and G2A Strategy. So, as promised, remember to follow or subscribe to the show, and whilst you're there, do leave us a review as well. It really helps other CISOs and cybersecurity enthusiasts find the show. Thanks for listening. Goodbye.